Hey, this is John from the Federal Tech Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about service mesh and the federal government. Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Today in the virtual studio, we have Branden Wood. He's a director for U.S. federal government at a company called Tetrate, Tetrate. The purpose of this podcast is to bring new ideas to my federal listeners to see how they can solve problems. And one big problem was solved at the Air Force by using the Tetrate solution. I thought we'd brag Branden in here, and maybe he could explain to my listeners, maybe in other agencies, other parts of the DoD, exactly what Tetrate can do and how they've worked out so well with the Air Force. But before we begin, give us a little bit about your background, Branden, and we'll just focus on this Air Force win.
Yeah, thanks, John. Appreciate it. My background's been a little bit different than most sales folks you probably talk to. I actually came directly out of school, and then I worked in a data center, Quest Communications, where we hosted co-location services and applications and websites right before the .com thing happened for a lot of the federal government. After September 11th, I was contacted by the Securities Exchange Commission and asked to design and implement a backup infrastructure as I lost their largest building after September 11th. So went on a little bit of roadshow, spent about 2 years deploying backup infrastructure for the Securities Exchange Commission, came back, and it was a big telework push. So I actually designed and implemented an entire VPN solution for the Securities Exchange Commission back then. Then went on to become branch chief of end user technology at the SEC. Part of those responsibilities were to do patch management, application deployment for the Securities Exchange Commission. I found this tiny little company called BigFix that did patch management and software deployment.
I remember them. Yeah.
So I was the original sales engineer, actually professional services engineer at BigFix after I left the SEC to kind of start the federal program there. Since then, I've been at security startups, for pretty much for the remainder of my career, both in an engineering capacity as well as building and starting the federal sales programs as well.
It sounds like you're the pioneer. You got all the arrows and all the broken noses and the scars.
I've certainly been through it, John. Certainly.
Well, that's what I want. I don't want someone, hey, I read a book. I got my CASSP from taking a multiple choice test, which maybe you have it. But anyway, I have a bias against it. Anyway, so you got a strong background. SEC got to be secure. And I think people generally in the federal government, they know that there's a lot of innovation at the Air Force. Within the DoD, they sure know there's innovation in the Air Force. And what they've innovated is what these software factories. And the challenge, I think, is that if we have software factories that are in different geographic locations, how can you transfer code and go back and forth and do it securely? And I think a thumbnail sketch of Tetrate's in order here. Started in 2017, a couple of Google engineers, they saw a problem and they come up with a solution for this using open source. And it looks like the Air Force has tested it out and decided to apply it.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have now become the de facto standard for service mesh capabilities inside of the United States Air Force. It really started from as they were developing the reference design architecture for DevSecOps, and as they were starting to stand up the Platform One program, they understood that we've got so many disparate organizations and environments, whether that is different cloud providers, whether it is things that are running on premise, whether it's old things that are running, monolithic applications and virtual machines. What is the connective tissue amongst all these applications? How are they all communicating with one another? How do we streamline this process to really get applications to the warfighter in production faster? I think the typical ATO was somewhere around 6 months to get fully accredited to be able to actually deploy applications in the environment. And the goal was to reduce that time drastically. So it came up with this notion of continuous ATO, which is, how do we certify this thing on a continuous basis? Versus, someone coming down with a clipboard once a year and saying, hey, did you do this? Did you remove these permissions? And so forth and so on. So it became clear that the service mesh was going to be a necessary or critical component of this. What the service mesh is doing is actually abstracting the network layer from the underlying application itself. Now, typically we see this inside of a Kubernetes environment or inside of a cloud environment, but we also have the ability to go ahead and provide that connectivity back to monolithic applications that may be running on premise or inside of virtual machines. Now, by abstracting that, we no longer have to ask the developers and the application owners to go through all the necessary hoops that we have to go through to build a federal application. Those could include end-to-end mutual MTLS encryption across data in motion. This could be things like integrating in with your single sign-on application, whether that's Active Directory federated systems, or this is CAT card integration, or this is Okta. Every time you build an application, if you have to build integration points with all those different environments, becomes very cumbersome, very expensive, and very time-consuming to do. So the Air Force came to us originally and said, hey, look, we need to come up with a way to integrate single sign-on so that we know we're starting to provide zero trust principles. We want to know who the users are that are accessing the applications and ensure that only authorized users can do so. So that was the initial conversation we had around providing these SSO capabilities. Essentially, we just turn the functionality on. No matter what application you build, we provide that functionality. Then it expanded into east-west traffic management. You talk a lot about zero trust, and that's the big buzzword. And I'm not going to tell you that Tetrate is going to be your silver bullet for zero trust, but we're a step in the right direction. So east-west traffic management is applying security policies to reduce the overall blast radius of a microservices application. If an attacker were to compromise a piece of that service, where else can they go? A front-end system probably doesn't need to have network connectivity into a back-end database or a credit card processing system. So let's implement the service mesh to reduce that blast radius and make sure that no one can actually penetrate or get further inside of the network.
Yeah, I was taking notes here when you said SSO and then who authenticated. I think strike zone for zero trust. And it's like it almost predated zero trust. It was like that's the requirements. I mean, that's requirements. And I want to talk about requirements now. I listen to podcasts all the time, and I'm listening to all kinds of zero trust specifications. And there's DoD, there's OMB, there's NIST, and there's CISA and this, and there's a new set of maturity guidelines from CISA. Well, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Branden spent the last 2 years complying with the current ones, and now they have new ones. And talk about speed bump on getting your ATO. I think this is a challenge, and maybe you've addressed some of those concerns with compliance at a global scale.
Yeah, it certainly is. One of our founding engineers, Zach Butcher, actually works directly with NIST on exactly that, on exactly zero trust principles, specifically around zero trust in microservices environments. He's co-authored NIST 800-204A, B, and C, as well as the most recent one that I believe is still in draft, maybe on final, NIST 800-207. And that really is all about zero trust in microservices applications. And the whole thought process is assuming that you are already compromised, and how do you limit that overall blast radius and what they can actually access. Now, previously, it was based on, just like you said, single sign-on, making sure only authorized users had access to the application. And then you would set up network enclaves or boundaries. So here's your database enclave where your database server sits, your applications sit over here, your web front end sit over here. You put in a firewall in between the middle of them, and you assume you're secure because only the critical infrastructure can communicate with one another. But we can't make that assumption anymore. We assume that the attacker is already sitting in the environment. So how do we now reduce what communication or where the attacker can move inside of the organization once he has achieved compromise? And that's really what the NIST 800-207 is it's no longer just about putting it in these different enclaves. It's really about isolating and making these microservices true to the form function of just allowing communication on what's strictly necessary.
Would your company like to help out women in technology? Well, do I have an event for you? It's called Bike for Your Beer. October 11th, 2023, we assemble at Carasoft, ride our bikes out to Caboose Brewing, get a t-shirt, some pictures with women in technology, and maybe even a beer. You get it all. Exercise, photos for your company website, and meet potential partners. 100% goes to women in technology. For more details, go to bikeforyourbeer.com.
In the springtime, I went down to the AWS Summit and recorded a bunch of interviews down there, had a lot of fun, met people, 10,000 people down there. And in preparing for this interview, I went to the Tetrate website, saw some press releases, and now you're partnering with AWS. So what this means is if you work for a federal agency and you're listening to this podcast, well, it seems like you work right. And tell us about this recent release.
Yeah, so this is it's pretty exciting. We're calling this Tetrate Service Express. Essentially what this is, it's a custom tailored version of our Tetrate Service Bridge for AWS environments. Now, typically when you deploy applications and you want them to be highly available, you want them to be secure, you want them to be across different regions, there's a lot of work that needs to be done with network load balancers, application load balancers, Route 53 for DNS entries across the board. We're taking all that guesswork out of the equation for you. By simply implementing Tetrate Service Express, we can now We do the direct API integration into those AWS services. So as you deploy the application, we can make them highly available. We will go ahead and implement the service or security policies to ensure that there is no access that is unnecessary. We will also provide the ability to do canary testing if necessary. I feel very confident my version 1.1 of the software I'm running today. We've got a whole lot of new improvements in version 1.2 that's coming down the pipe, but we don't trust it yet fully. So why don't we say 2% of all requests, we're going to go put over to version 1.2, while 98% of our population still sits on 1.1. And as we get more comfortable, that ratio starts changes until we're in full production. So these are just some of the capabilities that we're offering as part of Tetrate Service Express. And it really is just almost a turn it on, and the functionality and integration points are already there with AWS.
Tetrate's pretty easy to remember, Tetrate, easy to spell. But there is a open source project that's associated with your company, and it's called Istio. Kind of an unusual name, not a common, trippingly in the tongue. So what is Istio, and where does it fit in with your offering?
So Istio is the service mesh itself, and it's actually one of the underpinnings of our flagship product, Tetrate Service Bridge, as well as Tetrate Service Express. Underneath those things, in addition to Istio, there's Envoy, and there's a few other open source projects that sit underneath those two products. But essentially, that's the worker horse for the actual service mesh itself. What's interesting is if you look at some of the press releases came out about a month ago now. Istio became the fastest graduating project of the CNCF library since Kubernetes. So it's been vastly adopted. There's the community is very, very large, and the community supports it very passionately. What we've done is we've added support to that. Our founders came directly from the Google team that originally developed Istio. So we have the knowledge, we have the support base to be able to support our customers. In addition, we also provide out-of-band support. So the community is going to update you and provide fixes and feature functionality releases on a pretty regular basis. Maybe it's 2 weeks, maybe it's a month, but they're not going to support you out years in the out period. So if you look at the federal government, a lot of times we can't upgrade right away. There's critical applications or mission critical functionality that we just can't do the upgrades right on time. So Tetrate actually will support you so that you can continue running for about 13 months on legacy code just to keep you up and running. In addition, we've added or swapped out the encryption libraries inside of open source Istio so that we actually have FIPS verified encryption libraries. So you literally get instant on FIPS capabilities with the Tetrate Istio subscription.
Yeah, I noticed that in the press release. FIPS 142 certified. I mean, that's kind of a big deal, as Ron Burgundy would say. And this in your community there, the Air Force is a big deal.
Oh, absolutely.
So I'm trying to go up to the Air Force here. Let's go to 40,000 feet and try to look at your company. So is Linux is to Red Hat as Istio is to Tetrate? Is that can we say that?
I think that's a pretty good comparison. We take other things outside of just Istio itself, but at the end of the day, we are an Istio company, and we look to take what the community has offered and developed and all the bright folks out in the community, and then we look to make it better and make it easier to leverage and actually implement inside of the federal organizations.
The Air Force demands high availability. I just do. I mean, with the missions here on, I hope Absolutely. They do. And so where do you guys fit in with that? So
from a high availability perspective, if you look at, typically you have maybe multiple clouds. The Air Force and the DoD specifically leverages AWS GovCloud and the Azure platform extensively. But if you look at a new program, there's Cloud One today. Cloud One next is we're expecting an RFP soon. But they've already talked in some of their coffee talks about them adding additional capabilities inside of the Oracle Cloud as well as the Google Cloud. So now you have all these different regions and all these different cloud providers. They don't all operate the same way. They don't all speak the same language. We thought Kubernetes was going to be the answer to that. People used to call it the operating system of the cloud. But now you've got these different flavors and different distributions out there, whether it's Red Hat OpenShift or Rancher. And as they add new additional features and functionality to the different distributions, the disparity begins to get that much further apart. And it's not as easy to leverage all these different environments to have all that high availability that the DoD and other customers look for. So what we're doing is we're abstracting that network layer, and we become that network layer. So now we can start doing high availability based on location. It could be based on load. So if something inside of the AWS environment is experiencing high load or high demand, we can start failing over dynamically into the Azure environment. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking all these different CSPs and we're going to go sit a layer above it, and we're going to start doing the management and the traffic directing on behalf of the organization itself.
I just went up to 40,000 feet. I'm going to come down and go 20 years in the background, 10 years in the background. We know when Kubernetes popped in there and containers, they manage the containers and does a pretty good job of that. We know that. And what I'm trying to, if I had a whiteboard here, we could argue about this, but it seems that they're taking over this. You just said the network structure of the containers to allow for traffic configuration, authentication, metrics, and monitoring. It seems like it's almost network service almost, is it? Am I correct here?
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of going down the right path. I like to look at it, like I said, I started a long time ago in the data center world, and I would be responsible for managing switches and routers and F5 load balancers and all these different things, and checkpoint firewalls. And at the end of the day, if we still live in that world, I would feel pretty confident that I could build you a pretty secure environment with different enclaves. Today, however, you can't do that. You can't go knock on the AWS data center and say, hey, I've got some applications here. Can I go put my checkpoint firewall in? Or can I go put this load balancer in? So what we're doing is we're now doing application aware networking. And we literally are taking over that network stack. I don't care what the underlying network service is inside of your flavor of Kubernetes, whether it's Calico or Flannel. We don't care. We're going to abstract that layer and take care of that for you.
I have to admit that it almost, I've been in disagreements with people about what is cloud native, what isn't cloud native. But you guys started in the cloud. I mean, it's like, of course, I live in Florida. Of course, they have air conditioning. I mean, if you started Google, you're going to be by definition cloud native. So that is a checkbox that our listeners don't have to worry about, do they?
It is. No, and we actually work backwards for most of our listeners. Most of our listeners, their IT footprint has been in there since the 90s, and it's rather monolithic and it's rather aging, and they are really trying to figure out that transition to the cloud. Some customers I talk to and I say, what does your cloud journey look like? And they say, well, we have Office 365. And that's about the extent of their cloud journey, where others are much more further down the path, like Air Force, where they have applications that are delivered almost on a daily basis directly to the warfighter. So you've got this transition point of how do I get from point A to point B? We did it the exact opposite. We started in the cloud and then we worked our way back into the data center. So we've got many customers today where we've inserted ourselves running on-prem, and we give a picture of what this transition will look like. If I were to go to a customer and say, hey, you've got all these different applications out here that are running inside of your cloud, they're running inside of your data center. Can you draw a diagram of what that application connectivity looks like? And maybe 5 days later, when we get 50 folks in a room with a big whiteboard, maybe we have an accurate depiction of what that looks like, but it probably still isn't accurate. What we strive to do is, let's insert ourselves on-prem today. Let me start dynamically drawing out that picture for you, show you exactly what that architecture looks like today, show you how the connectivity is to your cloud presence today, and let's utilize this tool as a transition point. How do we map this out? What is our transition plan going to look like? Oh, and by the way, how do we do it with zero downtime? And that's where this high availability and canary testing also comes into play. So yeah, like you said, we started in the cloud, but we did the opposite path of what most of our customers are doing. So we sit right alongside with them.
Yeah, let's go back to the whiteboard here. So if I draw a little container here, and I got another container here, and the way you would describe it would be maybe service to service communication, because each container may have a service associated with it. And so what you're doing is it is an abstracting to the network level. It's almost using Kubernetes to manage some parts of the containers, but the next level is a whole different way. It's like BASF. We don't make tape, we make it sound better or something like that. We don't make the container, but we make the containers more practical, or get secure in transit too.
Correct. Yeah. And it's not just about the security workload. It's ultimately just how do we get things out to the population faster? And if I have to go through all these hoops to build these applications, at the end of the day, you're behind the times. The application is not meeting the demands that are necessary today versus when we design these things. So by abstracting again, the network layer, but also the authentication layer and the user identity layer, now we have the capability of getting the applications to the mission that much faster. And we're just doing that by abstracting a lot of the different layers from the containers themselves.
Well, Branden, you're kind of a young guy, but you've been in the trenches for 20 years. So time for you to put on your smart guy hat and tell me what's the next 20 years? Just the next 5 years. Where do you see this whole transition taking place? I think there's going to be some kind of an incident where people are going to have to smarten up and be as concerned as the Air Force is now. I mean, there's some activities in some civilian agencies that aren't as tightly run as the Air Force.
Yeah,
so I think. Give me a 5-year plan. Give me 5 years, Branden.
I think we're actually going to see some connectivity, some applications move back on-prem. I think there was an early jump from some of the early adopters that moved into cloud environments, and it didn't end up being the utopia that they thought it was going to be. And I think that's just because there wasn't supporting products like a Tetrate to sit alongside them. So, some people are a little gun shy, and I think we're going to start seeing some of that connectivity come back on-prem, and it may be because of a security incident or something like that. But then you're going to see a massive push back to a cloud where it becomes 100% cloud, probably in the next 5 years. But I do think we're going to recoil a bit and then move back into the cloud area. And Tetrate provides the perfect transition point, whether it's to move things back closer to you on-prem or move things back into the cloud. Providing that observability, the metrics, the planning, the transformation, it really becomes critical to be able to take things from on-prem to the cloud and back as often as you want to.
Well, there's something called a word cloud where you took a bunch of phrases that are used and you see what the important ones are. And I think cloud native is one, but I think repatriation is one you just mentioned coming back in. Mm-hmm. And if you just look at how they've trended over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, you can see a little bump on this repatriation, but I think it's going to be a bounce back. In fact, I can see some on-prem organizations using cloud tools because they've matured. I guess there's a word that people use. They finally matured. And now you have Tetrate to stand next to you, where in 2016, it was some guys getting frustrated at Google, beating their head against the wall, arguing with the whiteboard how to fix this problem.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And that's the reason that I joined Tetrate to start the federal program here is, that's where the market is going, and that's where the market needs to be. Are we a little bit ahead of the market? Maybe a little bit, but as I talk to more and more federal customers, if they're not in implementation phases right now, they're in planning phases, and we look to meet them right there in the middle and help them with that journey.
Great. Well, you've given us a better idea what Tetrate's all about. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Branden Wood, Director, U.S. Federal Government at Tetrate. Thanks, Branden.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.